let's figure out what is going on in these passages. Kathy, as we were talking, I said, I'm going to preach on the Beatitudes. She said, what is being blessed? And I was like, that's a great question. So will you join me in prayer as we begin? Holy One who we call beloved, help us remember that you, too, name us as your beloved. May these words remind us of that. Amen. So as I mentioned, the next 3 Sundays, I will be focusing on the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew. This is a long teaching discourse, and it's chock-a-block full of often quoted parables and sayings. It reminded me a little bit, following on the heels of Martin Luther King Day, how we pull out all of these memeable quotes out of context and kind of we know them all, but sometimes we haven't read the original. So in the same way, sometimes it's helpful to recontextualize well-known Bible verses and put them back in their wider context and really take in the whole picture. The widest lens of that picture, of that speech, is the gospel in which this speech emerges from, Matthew's gospel. So how is the Matthean gospel different than the other ones? How is the Jesus that we come to know different in Matthew than it is in the other gospels? Each gospel emerged from the stories told and retold by unique communities of faith living in different geographical locations in a particular period of time. So these were oral stories that were told and retold as communities dispersed and attempted to follow this Messiah person. They weren't sure who he was yet. And each gospel differs slightly because of that context that they emerged from, and also because their authors of the gospel, surprise, surprise, had very human agendas. The authors of each gospel emphasized different aspects of Jesus' ministry and divinity, depending on what was going on in their context. So, for example, the Markan Jesus is a man of few words and all action. I mean, the guy just races from thing to thing and hardly says 2 words. Whereas the Jesus in Luke's gospel, I kind of think is a party animal, honestly. He's constantly at dinner parties. And if he's not at a dinner party, he's going to one or he's coming back from one. He does not stop reclining and drinking his wine. The Matthean Jesus, who we're hearing from today, he has emphasized his roles as a teacher and a healer. So he's the one who has these long passages where he just talks and talks. So we either see him moving from person to person, community to community, healing. He did a lot of that. Or he embarks on these long speeches. And if authors emphasize parts of Jesus' ministry in response to what's happening in their community, it can also be helpful to know a little bit about the author's intended audience. So the author's community and context for the Gospel of Matthew is believed to be located in Syria, which is quite a distance from Jesus' original ministry in modern-day Palestine or Israel. Scholars estimate it was written between 80 to 90 years after Jesus' death. So this is a community that's in its 2nd generation of believers, long past any firsthand knowledge of events. These are stories that have been passed down. The primary Jewish religious and spiritual anchor, the temple in Jerusalem, which was the nucleus of religious life for the Jewish people, has recently been violently destroyed by the Romans in response to the Jewish uprising following Jesus' death. So the Jewish community as a whole is really at a loss for how do we find our center, what's our nucleus of belief? And this particular community is beginning to struggle a bit with that Jewish identity. They're still very much anchored in the Jewish tradition, but they're also trying to make room for the Gentiles who want to join in this belief of Jesus as Messiah. And they're beginning to get some distance from the Jewish folks that have concluded that he was not the Messiah because he did not save the temple and do the other things that the prophecies had foretold. So Matthew is seen as kind of trying to bridge that gap. And as you read it, you can see little clues that he's sort of giving crumbs to the Jewish community, giving crumbs to the Gentile community, and trying to build a narrative where Jesus is, of rooting Jesus in the Jewish tradition while also telling stories of his expansive welcome. Part of the way he does this, the author, is he emphasizes parallels between Jesus and another revered Jewish leader. Anybody remember a leader that walks up to a mountain to teach? Moses. Yes. So in the same way, Moses walks up to a mountain, receives divine wisdom, and then brings it down to his people. In his very first speech, Jesus goes up to the mountain. Although in this story, his disciples follow him, and he gives the wisdom there. And then long teaching speeches that I kind of mentioned in Matthew, there are 5 of them, which is also the same number of books in the Torah. So there's just little clues of sort of emphasizing the Matthean Jesus, emphasizing he is one of the prophets in this long lineage. Excuse me. And as we turn our attention to just this sermon, it's important for us to note that the Sermon on the Mount is at the very, very beginning of Jesus' ministry as told in the Gospel of Matthew. All that has happened so far is Jesus was born. He was baptized by John the Baptist. He spent 40 days in the wilderness. He called his first disciples, and upon John's arrest, he's proclaimed his ministry. That's literally all that's happened. Alan did read a paragraph 2 weeks ago at the very beginning of Jesus beginning to preach and heal. But this sermon in Matthew is what launches his public ministry. So it's the very beginning. Okay, if you're not a Bible geek like me, you're wondering where I'm going with all this. If you don't find this just intrinsically fascinating, you're probably starting to wonder, like, wow, this is a lot of info, a lot of biblical context. What is the point of it? So I promise I'm getting to it. When Jesus announced his ministry only moments ago, in the wider context of this gospel, after John's arrest, he proclaims he is here to change hearts and minds, for the reign of heaven is at hand. So if you have that in context, naturally, upon his first teaching, those who have come to follow him, along with all the crowds that are following them, are probably eager to learn. Just how do we do that? How do we change our hearts and minds? If that's what you've come to do, tell us what to do. What do we need to do to attain a divine blessing, to take part in this reign of heaven that you are beginning to talk about? So remember again, the intended audience is a blend of Jewish and Gentile folks wanting to live out this new Messiah's commandments, right? Moses went up to the mountain. He gave his commandments. So here Jesus is walking up to the mountain. He's going to tell us what to do, how to belong. But Jesus, rather than offering a checklist or how-to manual, offers a series of baffling statements. Not imperative statements, not you should do this, not commands, but rather a series of declarative statements about who we are. Blessed. The people listening, the disciples and the gathered crowds, are the poor, the oppressed, the sick. They are the heartbroken, the ones lacking power, the hungry. And remember, they also included the original audience, the hearers of Matthew's gospel, a community trying to knit themselves together, wounded by the loss of the temple and nurturing a minority religion in its infancy. They are ordinary people, his listeners. Because who among us is not those things? Who among us today is not harboring grief over the loss of a loved one through death or broken relationship? Who among us is not hungering for a world in which Tyree Nichols could have made it home safely instead of being beaten to death by the police? among us has not had our spiritual or religious beliefs misunderstood or misconstrued and lost relationships over it? Who among us does not feel powerless and broken watching the climate of our beloved planet tick upward each year? In the Beatitudes, Jesus tells his listeners, tells us that we are already included in the realm of God, just as we are. There is no striving, there is no to-doing, no attainment that we need to achieve before being included in God's expansive yes. Just as you are, Jesus says, you already have the divine blessing. In your brokenness, in your need, in your feeling of lack, of not enoughness, of yearning, you are blessed. What a complete opposite of how the term blessed has become known today, where we've come to use it as a shorthand for lucky with a sprinkle of God's will. People post pictures of their gorgeous, happy family, their exotic beach vacation, their peaceful, well-cleaned home, and they hashtag blessed. They tag it, hashtag blessed. It's so common that it's become a meme in and of itself. It's sort of known as a humble brag, as they say. It's like a way of saying, look how rich I am, look how wealthy, look how well together my life is, and implies with the hashtag blessed, that you are all these things because of some divine reward. You are all of these things because God themselves made it so. Not because of the unjust system we live in, not the messed up capitalism that rewards a lucky few, not the circumstance of birth or race or inherited wealth, just hashtag blessed, because God likes me best. The very beginning of Jesus' teaching ministry in Matthew, the very beginning, Jesus does not begin with, thou shalt, or do this and get rewarded. He begins with, you are, and ends with, blessed. Included in God's love already. As you are, Jesus continues, you have flavor and richness. As you are salt of the earth. Do not water yourself down to fit. Do not lose sight of the flavor that is you. The world needs you, your unique saltiness, to bring out the vibrant flavors of what is around you. As you are light. You have a light that needs to be seen, that deserves to shine. Your light in shining brightly and not being dimmed by circumstance or covered by false humility brings light to the rest of us. Can guide us when our own light feels uncertain or weak. Can draw a fractured community together. Can shine each other home. When we move out into the world, when we get swept up in the I need tos and the I shoulds, when we begin to be swept up into the narrative that life is supposed to be only happiness, only ease, when we want to shrink ourselves to fit or wish we were different, we can remember and anchor ourselves in this. That Jesus' first words to his community, to Matthew's community, to us, are, beloved, blessed is where you begin. May we remember to live into this. Blessed, salt, light. Amen.